October 14th, 1943. 25,000 feet over Germany. The air outside the thin aluminum skin of the bomber is 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze a man's fingers to metal, cold enough that a gunner who pulls off a glove to clear a jammed gun can lose the skin of his hand. Inside a B-17, a waist gunner watches the sky to his right. He is 19 years old. He has been told, for as long as he has worn the uniform, that the machine he rides in can protect itself. He has been told that the guns bristling from every window, from the nose and the tail and the belly and the top, will keep the German fighters at a distance. He has been told that if the formation holds tight, if every bomber stays in its box, the massed fire of 100 aircraft will build a wall of lead that no fighter can cross. He watches the little friendly shapes off his wing, the P-47 Thunderbolts that came out over the channel with them. And then he watches those shapes bank away and turn for home. The escorts are out of fuel range. They can go no further. They waggle their wings and they leave. The bombers fly on alone. Ahead of them lies the target, the ball-bearing works at a town called Schweinfurt, deep inside the Reich. And rising to meet them in numbers no crewman had ever seen, comes the entire weight of the German day fighter force. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, twin-engine fighters lobbing rockets from beyond the range of the bomber guns. They come in waves from the front, where a B-17 was weakest, closing at a combined speed that gave a gunner barely a second to fire. For the next 2 hours, the men of the 8th Air Force will fight the longest, bloodiest air battle of the war to that date, and they will fight it without a single friendly fighter in the sky. When it is over, 60 bombers will be gone. Some accounts, counting the aircraft that limped home and were written off as scrap, put the number closer to 80. 600 young men will not come back. 594 of them listed as missing. 65 taken prisoner. And the ones who did make it home will climb down onto the hard stand shaking, some of them weeping, some of them simply silent. And they will understand something the men who planned the mission had refused to understand for a year. The self-defending bomber could not defend itself. Now hold that picture. Hold the cold, and the wall of fighters, and the empty sky where the escorts should have been. Because the man who sent those boys out without fighters, the man who built the doctrine that put them there, was not a bomberman at all. He was a fighter pilot. One of the finest America had ever produced. He had spent his whole life in the cockpit of small, fast, single-engine aircraft. He had helped write the book on American air power, quite literally, and he believed, with the certainty of a true believer, that these bombers did not need men like his younger self to protect them. His name was Ira Eaker, and this is the story of how a fighter pilot became the great defender of the fighterless bomber, how he held to that idea through the deadliest year the 8th Air Force would ever know, and how he was removed from his command just a few short weeks before the very weapon he had neglected arrived in the sky and proved him wrong and proved him right all at once. They took his command away right before it won. And to understand why that is one of the great tragedies of the American Air War, you have to understand the man. So let us go back to the beginning. Ira Clarence Eaker was born on April 13th, 1896, in Field Creek, Texas, a speck of a place in the hill country, the son of a tenant farmer who worked land he did not own. There was nothing in that childhood to suggest the sky. The family moved north into Oklahoma when he was a boy, chasing better dirt to farm. He walked to a country schoolhouse. He was clever, and he was ambitious, and he understood early that the only way out of the red clay was education. He graduated from a small teacher's college in Durant, Oklahoma, in 1917, the year America went to war. He took a commission in the infantry, but something pulled his eyes upward. The airplane, in 1917, was barely more than a decade old, a fragile contraption of wood and wire and doped fabric, and the men who flew it were regarded as half-mad. Eaker wanted in. He learned to fly at the dusty training fields of Texas, earned his wings, and by the end of the First War, he was a rated pilot looking for a career in a service that most senior officers considered a passing fad. Here's the first thing you need to hold on to. Ira Eaker was, by trade and by temperament, a pursuit pilot, a fighter pilot. In the years between the wars, when the Army Air Arm was tiny and starved of money, Eaker made his name in fast, single-engine aircraft. In 1926 and 1927, he flew the Pan-American Goodwill Flight around South America and earned one of the earliest distinguished flying crosses. And then, in January of 1929, he did the thing that made him famous across the country. They called the airplane the question mark. It was a tri-motor, and the idea was audacious. Keep it in the air without landing for as long as humanly possible, refueling in flight from another aircraft trailing a hose. Nobody had really done it. Eaker was one of the pilots. The mission commander was a man named Carl Spaatz, and another of the crew was a young officer named Elwood Quesada. And those names will matter later because these three men would rise together and shape the entire American air war. The question mark stayed aloft for 150 hours and 40 minutes, more than 6 days in the air, passing fuel from plane to plane in a time when such a thing was close to witchcraft. Eaker was at the controls for much of it. The flight made headlines from coast to coast, and it made Eaker something rare in that small service, a pilot the public actually knew by name. He was not finished proving things. In 1936, he made the first transcontinental blind flight, flying from the west coast to the east, relying only on his instruments, the cockpit hooded, so he could not cheat by looking outside. Think about the nerve that took to fly across a continent through weather, unable to see the ground, trusting a handful of gauges. This was a man who understood flying at the deepest level, who had bet his own life on his skill more times than most pilots ever would. And he could write. This is the other piece of Ira Eaker, and it is essential. Alongside his close friend and mentor Henry Arnold, the officer everyone called Hap, Eaker co-authored 3 books on aviation in the 1930s and early 1940s. Books with titles like This Flying Game and Winged Warfare and Army Flyer. Eaker was the man who could take the ideas of air power and put them into clean, persuasive English. He was a thinker and a communicator in a service that badly needed both. When the American Air Arm needed someone to make its case, to Congress, to the public, to skeptical generals, Eaker was often the man holding the pen. So picture him now on the eve of the war, a Texas farm boy who climbed out of poverty on brains and nerve, a record-setting pilot, a published author on air power, a protege of Hap Arnold who would soon command the entire Army Air Forces, and, at his core, a fighter pilot who had spent his life in the cockpit of the very machines that the 8th Air Force would soon leave on the ground. That is the man. Now watch what he does with the most important command of his life. Before we go on, if you're the kind of person who cares about getting this history right, the aircraft, the dates, the men, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Consider subscribing to Air Command and stay to the end, because the twist in the story is not the disaster you already expect. It is what happened to the man afterward. And if your father or your grandfather flew with the 8th in a bomber or a fighter, tell us in the comments. Tell us his group, his station, his name. The men who lived this deserve to be remembered by more than a statistic. And this community is one of the few places their stories still get spoken aloud. Now, back to Ira Eaker and the winter he arrived in England. In February of 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor pulled America into the war, Brigadier General Ira Eaker landed in England with a tiny staff, 6 officers in all, and a mission that bordered on the impossible. He was to build, from nothing, an American bombing force on British soil. No aircraft yet, no crews yet, no bases. Just an idea and the promise that the machines and the men would follow. The British had been at war for more than 2 years. They had tried daylight bombing early, and they had been slaughtered for it. And they had retreated into the darkness, bombing German cities by night, area bombing, hitting whole districts because by night that was all they could hit. When the Americans arrived talking about precision daylight bombing, about flying into Germany in broad daylight to hit specific factories, the British thought they were naive. They thought these confident young Americans were about to learn a very hard lesson. Eaker knew what they thought, and he gave them an answer that became famous. He told his British hosts that the Americans would not do much talking until they had done more fighting, and that after they had gone, he hoped the British would be glad they came. It was gracious, and it was steel underneath. He was not going to argue theory. He was going to prove it in the sky. The doctrine Eaker carried across the Atlantic had been born in the 1930s at a place called the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama. A group of brilliant young officers there had worked out a theory of war that would define American air power for a generation. The theory went like this: a modern bomber, flying high, in tight formation, bristling with heavy machine guns, could defend itself against enemy fighters through massed crossfire. Fly enough of them together in what they called a combat box, and the overlapping fields of fire would be a fortress in the sky. You would not need fighters to escort them. The bombers would be self-defending. And because they flew by day, they could aim with precision, could put their bombs on a factory, a bridge, an oil refinery, and cripple an enemy's ability to wage war by destroying the vital organs of his economy. It was an elegant idea. It was, in its way, a beautiful idea. War made surgical, victory through the destruction of things rather than the slaughter of men in trenches. And there was one more piece to it, a piece that would prove fatal. The men who built this doctrine believed that a fighter with the range to escort a bomber deep into Germany was simply not possible. A fighter was small. It could not carry enough fuel to fly to Berlin and back and still have the performance to fight when it got there. Everyone knew this. It was treated as a law of nature. And so the escort problem was not really a problem at all. It was an impossibility, and you do not plan around impossibilities. You build a bomber that does not need one. Eaker believed all of it. And in the autumn of 1942, with only a handful of missions flown, he began to say so out loud in writing to the most powerful men in the American Air Forces. The first American heavy bomber raid in Europe went out on August 17, 1942. 12 B-17s, escorted that day by British Spitfires because the target was close, just across the channel at the railroad yards at Rouen in occupied France. Eaker did not watch from a desk. He flew on the raid himself in a bomber named Yankee Doodle. All 12 came back. Before the mission, he had written to Hap Arnold that the theory of daylight bombardment was about to be tested, and that this time, men's lives were being put at stake. It was a rare flash of the weight he carried. But the raid was a success, and success has a way of hardening belief into certainty. Through that autumn, Eaker wrote to Arnold with growing confidence. He told his commander that his officers were absolutely convinced that 300 heavy bombers could attack any target in Germany with losses of less than 4%. 4%. Remember that number, because the sky over Schweinfurt would make a savage joke of it. He wrote that a large force of day bombers could operate without fighter cover against targets anywhere in Germany without excessive losses. Anywhere in Germany, without fighters, without excessive losses. This was not a junior officer's guess. This was the considered judgment of the commanding general of the American bomber effort in Europe, and he staked everything on it. On December 1st, 1942, Eaker took command of the entire 8th Air Force when Karl Spaatz moved on to North Africa. He now owned the whole thing. The bombers, the crews, the doctrine, and the consequences. Then came the moment that nearly ended the daylight campaign before it truly began, and it is the moment that shows you the very best of Ira Eaker. In January of 1943, the Allied leaders met at Casablanca in Morocco to plan the next phase of the war, and Winston Churchill arrived intending to kill American daylight bombing. The British Prime Minister wanted the Americans to give up their costly daytime raids and join the Royal Air Force in the night, bombing under cover of darkness. To the British, it seemed obvious. Daylight bombing looked like a bloody, stubborn American fantasy. Hap Arnold knew the daylight campaign was in mortal danger, and he knew who to send. He summoned Eaker to Casablanca and told him he had to change Churchill's mind. Eaker sat down and did what he did better than almost anyone in the American Air Forces. He wrote. 1 page. A single page laying out the case for day bombing in language a politician could feel in his gut. And he asked to see Churchill in person. The argument that turned it was simple and unforgettable. If the Royal Air Force bombed Germany by night, and the Americans bombed by day, then the enemy would have no rest at all. The Germans would be under bombs around the clock. Eaker put it plainly to Churchill that bombing round the clock would give the devil no rest. Churchill, who loved a good phrase more than almost any man alive, rolled the words around and was won over, not fully convinced by his own admission, but persuaded to let the Americans keep trying. As one account of that meeting records, Churchill told the young airman that he had not been convinced Eaker was right, but that he had been persuaded Eaker should have the chance to prove his case. That 1 page and that one meeting saved American daylight bombing. Out of Casablanca came the directive that launched the combined bomber offensive, the British by night, the Americans by day. And a few months later, in June of 1943, came the point-blank directive, which set the priority clearly. Before any invasion of Europe could be attempted, the German Air Force and the industry that fed it had to be destroyed. Eaker had won his argument. The daylight campaign would go forward at full strength. And here is the tragedy folded inside the triumph. The very success of Casablanca committed Eaker and thousands of young men to a doctrine that was about to be tested to destruction. He had won the right to send his bombers deep into Germany. He had not solved the problem of how to keep them alive once they got there, and he still did not believe he needed to. Let me pause here and be fair to the man, because this story is not a simple one, and the people who lived it were not fools. The historian Tammy Davis Biddle, in her study of air power thinking called Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, describes what happened to men like Eaker as a kind of seeing what they wanted to see. The doctrine was not just a plan, it was a faith. These officers had spent their careers building the case for independent air power, for the war-winning bomber, And to admit that the bomber needed a fighter to hold its hand was to admit that the whole beautiful theory had a hole in the center of it. That is a hard thing for any person to do. It is harder still when you have staked your professional life on being right. Now, the doctrine was already cracking, and some men could see it. The problem was the fighter escort and the belief that it could not be built. Through 1943, the tools that might have saved the bombers existed, or nearly existed, and the leadership was slow to reach for them. The main American escort fighter of that year was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a huge, heavy, superb aircraft, rugged as an anvil and deadly in a dive. But it was thirsty. Even with a drop tank slung under its belly, it could only reach the German border and a little beyond before it had to turn for home. Beyond that line, the bombers were on their own. The other fighter, the P-38 Lightning, had the range on paper, but in the brutal cold and thin air high over Europe, its engines gave endless trouble, and it never became the answer people hoped for. Picture the geography of the problem, because this is what killed men. A bomber leaving England for a target deep in Germany might fly 600 or 700 miles each way. The P-47 of 1943, even hauling a belly tank, could reach out only a little past the German frontier before it had to turn for home or run dry over the North Sea. That left the most dangerous stretch of the whole mission, the deep interior, the target itself, and the long crawl back out, entirely uncovered. The Germans understood this perfectly. They learned exactly where the little friends turned back, and they waited just past that line, fresh and fueled, for the moment the bombers were left naked. The escort gap was not a small tactical detail. It was a killing zone, drawn on the map by the range of a fuel tank, and the men who flew into it knew to the mile where their protection would end. The answer, the real answer, was sitting in plain sight, and it was a story of institutional blindness that still stings to tell. In 1939, and again in 1941, the Air Corps had rejected proposals for auxiliary fuel tanks for fighters, on the grounds that they would just add weight for no good purpose. Drop tanks. The single cheapest, simplest technology that would eventually let a fighter fly all the way to Berlin, waved away as a needless bother, and Eaker's own priorities reflected the same blind spot. In the summer of 1943, when a proposal was floated to seriously study the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort, Eaker reportedly called the idea premature, as his bombers were beginning to die in numbers that should have made escort the most urgent problem in the entire theater. He ranked the development of long-range drop tanks as a low priority, a priority of 4, well down his list of needs. As late as the autumn of 1943, he still believed that a large enough formation would not truly need escort all the way to the target. There was a reason he clung to it, beyond simple stubbornness. Eaker believed the German fighters were concentrated in a narrow belt along the coast. Punch through that belt, he reasoned. Take your losses at the edge, and the interior of Germany would be relatively open. He was wrong. The Germans had built their air defense in depth, layer upon layer, more than 100 miles inland. There was no clear sky beyond the coast. There was only more of the enemy, all the way to the target and all the way home. The United States Army Air Forces even tried to solve the escort problem without building a fighter at all, and the attempt tells you everything about how deep the doctrine ran. They took the B-17 and turned it into a flying gunship. They called it the YB-40. They stripped out the bombs and packed it with extra machine guns and extra armor and extra turrets, the idea being that a few of these heavily armed escorts could fly along with the bomber formation and add their firepower to the defensive box. About a dozen of them reached England in the late spring of 1943. It was a total failure, and it failed for a reason that should have been obvious. Loaded down with all those guns and all that ammunition, the YB-40 was heavy. And once the real bombers dropped their bomb loads over the target and grew lighter and faster, the gunships could not keep up. They straggled behind the very formation they were meant to protect. The Germans were not impressed. The whole experiment was quietly dropped by that summer. Its one lasting gift was the chin turret, a pair of machine guns mounted under the nose to fight off the head on attacks that were killing so many crews, and that turret would become standard on the next model of the Flying Fortress, the B-17G, a better nose gun, not a fighter that could take you home alive. That was the answer the institution reached for, when the real answer was a drop tank and a Mustang. The historians Stephen McFarland and Wesley Newton, in their study of the air battle for Germany called To Command the Sky, make a point that lands hard. By the spring of 1943, the American Air Force's own schools were already teaching that the self-defending bomber could not, in fact, defend itself, that escort was essential. The institution was beginning to admit the truth in its classrooms, even as its commanders in the field kept flying the old doctrine into the guns. Eaker was not uniquely blind, but he was the man in the chair, and the chair is where the responsibility lives. And now the bill came due. Through the summer and autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force flew deeper and deeper into Germany, and the losses climbed toward numbers that no air force could sustain. In the last week of July, in a series of raids the crews called Blitz Week, the 8th lost 88 B-17s shot down, with many more damaged so badly they would never fly again. In a single week. The force was small in those days, a few hundred bombers, and to lose 88 of them in 7 days was a wound that cut to the bone. Then came August 17th, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after that first hopeful little raid on Rouen. This was the mission that was supposed to prove the doctrine, and instead it began to break it. The plan was ambitious to the point of arrogance, a double strike deep into southern Germany. One force, led by a hard-driving colonel named Curtis LeMay, would hit the Messerschmitt fighter factory at Regensburg and then, instead of turning back, fly on over the Alps to land in North Africa, confusing the German defenses. A second, larger force would strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the choke point that the planners believed fed the entire German war machine, since ball bearings went into nearly every engine and gun and vehicle the enemy built. The scale of it was enormous for that stage of the war. LeMay's wing put up around 146 flying fortresses for the Regensburg leg. The Schweinfurt force numbered around 230 more, nearly 400 heavy bombers in the air on a single day, the largest American effort yet flown against Germany, and every one of them committed to the belief that they could survive the trip on their own guns. It went wrong almost from the start. Fog over England delayed the takeoff and split the timing of the two forces. Instead of overwhelming the German defenses in one confusing rush, the two streams of bombers went in separately, and that gave the German fighters time to land, rearm, refuel, and rise again to hit the second wave. The Germans got 2 bites at the apple. LeMay's Regensburg force did the thing it was ordered to do. It bombed the fighter factory, then turned south, climbed over the Alps, and flew on to land at rough desert strips in North Africa, a feat of navigation and endurance that stands on its own. But the aircraft that reached Africa were battered, many of them barely flyable, and the shuttle idea that was supposed to confuse the German defenses did nothing to save the second force coming in behind. The Schweinfurt bombers flew into a hornet's nest that had already been stirred, and they paid for it. Of the roughly 376 bombers sent out that day, 60 did not come home. About 1 in every 6, more than 600 men. The Schweinfurt force alone lost 36 bombers out of 230. And for all that blood, the ball-bearing plants were hit but not destroyed. And German production, as the National World War II Museum notes, recovered with frightening speed. The enemy simply dispersed the machine tools and rebuilt. 60 bombers, 600 men, for a wound that healed in weeks. A few weeks later, on September 6th, a raid on Stuttgart cost another 45 bombers out of 262. The arithmetic was becoming a horror, and still the deep raids went on, because point blank demanded that the German Air Force be broken before the invasion, and the only tool the 8th had to break it was the bomber itself. The same brutal lesson was being written elsewhere that summer, in a different sky by different men. On August 1st, 1943, a force of B-24 liberators went in low over the oil refineries at Ploesti, in Romania, one of the great targets of the war. This was not Eaker's command. It drew on 9th Air Force strength and on liberator groups borrowed from the 8th, and it went in on the deck, at rooftop height, to catch the defenses by surprise. Of around 178 bombers that set out, more than 50 were lost, over 300 men killed or missing, more than 100 taken prisoner, and 5 Medals of Honor awarded for a single mission, the most for any air action of the war. And within weeks, the refineries were largely back in operation. Ploesti was a different theater and a different plan, but the moral rhymed with Schweinfurt. The promise that the bomber would always get through and always be worth the cost was being tested to destruction across the whole of the year. Roger Freeman, whose war diary of the 8th Air Force is as close to a day-by-day ledger of the campaign as exists, spent a lifetime tallying these missions, aircraft by aircraft and crew by crew. Read his accounting of the autumn of 1943, and a pattern jumps off the page. The 8th was not losing a bad day here and a bad day there. It was hemorrhaging its trained crews faster than the training pipeline back home could replace them, and it was doing so in the pursuit of a doctrine that assumed those crews would mostly survive. The math simply did not close, You cannot fight a long war on a theory that quietly consumes 3/4 of the men who test it. Which brings us back to where we began. October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday, the return to Schweinfurt. The planners knew the ball-bearing plants had not been finished off in August. They went back. 291 B-17s set out for the same target that had already cost so much. The P-47 escorts took them as far as their fuel allowed, only the first 200 miles or so, to about the German frontier near Aachen. And then, as always, the escorts turned for home and the bombers pressed on alone into the heart of Germany. What happened next was the worst single day the 8th Air Force had yet endured. The German controllers threw up everything they had, and this time they had learned every lesson. They hit the formation with rockets from outside gun range, with cannon fire, with head-on passes, with wave after wave of fighters that the bomber gunners could not hold off no matter how tight the box. 60 B-17s were shot down outright. Another 17 came home so badly shot up that they were written off as scrap. More than 100 others were damaged. 594 men were listed missing. 65 were taken prisoner. Of the men aboard the bombers, the official reckoning put the casualties at around 650 out of roughly 2,900 who flew, more than 1 in 5 in a single afternoon. You will see the loss figure given as 60 in many places, and as high as 80 in others, and the difference is simply a matter of what you count, whether you include the aircraft that reached England and never flew again. However you count it, the meaning was the same. The 8th Air Force had, for the moment, lost control of the daylight sky over Germany. Deep, unescorted penetration raids were suspended. They could not be flown. The Doctrine had met the German fighter force in open battle, and the Doctrine had lost. And here is the detail that ought to stay with you. In the immediate aftermath, Eaker put out a defiant public message, declaring that the 8th now had its teeth in the neck of the German Air Force. It was, as one museum history bluntly puts it, pure fiction. The truth was the reverse. It was the German Air Force that had its teeth in the 8th. But a commander cannot stand in front of his men in the press and admit that the theory he championed has just been bled white over Schweinfurt. So he said the brave thing, the false thing, and the deep raids stopped anyway because they had to. Let the full weight of that year settle for a moment because the human cost is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The historian Donald Miller, in his history of the 8th Air Force called Masters of the Air, lays the reality out without mercy. In 1943, a bomber crewman's odds of surviving his required tour of 25 missions were terrible. The National Museum of the United States Air Force records that only about 1 in 4 crewmen could expect to complete that tour. The other 3/4 would be killed, wounded, or captured before they reached mission number 25. Miller notes that of the men who flew against Germany before the invasion of France, some 77% became casualties. In one famous group, the 100th Bomb Group, only about 14% of the original crews that arrived in the spring of 1943 lived to finish their tours. Sit with that. A young man arriving at an English bomber base in 1943, he had a better chance of being killed, wounded, or captured than of simply going home. Across the whole war, the 8th Air Force would lose some 26,000 men killed, out of the hundreds of thousands who served, a toll that, as the men who keep that memory at the mighty 8th Museum point out, exceeded the total combat dead of the entire United States Marine Corps. The bomber crews of the 8th suffered a death rate that made a daylight bombing tour, statistically, more dangerous than storming a beach as a Marine. And consider what the Doctrine actually asked of them, hour after hour, to make the theory work. The combat box only defended itself if the formation stayed tight, which meant flying wingtip to wingtip for whole hours, in freezing air, wrestling a heavy 4-engine bomber through the propeller wash of the aircraft ahead, unable to take evasive action without breaking the box and exposing everyone. To hold the formation was to sit still and be shot at. To break it was to be picked off alone. There was no good choice, only the discipline to stay in place while the flak walked toward you and the fighters bored in from the front. That discipline was the Doctrine made flesh, and it was carried out by teenagers who had been flying powered aircraft for barely a year. And these were not nameless figures. Every one of them was somebody's son. Many were teenagers. They flew in an open-sided aluminum tube in air cold enough to kill exposed flesh, breathing through an oxygen mask, sitting on a flak jacket because the shrapnel came up through the floor, watching the bombers around them fall in flames and counting the parachutes, always counting the parachutes, because 10 men rode in each of those falling aircraft, and the difference between a survivor and a corpse was whether you saw the canopy blossom. This is the gap that sits at the center of this whole story. The gap between the officers who decided, in briefing rooms and headquarters buildings, that the bomber could go it alone, and the boys who died discovering that it could not. Ira Eaker did not fly to Schweinfurt. He sent men to Schweinfurt twice on the strength of a theory. And I want to be careful and honest here, because it would be easy and cheap to paint him as a villain, and he was not one. James Parton, who served as Eaker's own wartime aide and later wrote his biography, a book called Air Force Spoken Here, knew the man's decency and his agony over the losses. And the historians who have studied the constraints Eaker actually faced make a real case for the defense. He was chronically short of aircraft and crews because Washington kept diverting his strength to North Africa and to the new 15th Air Force in Italy. He was forced to waste precious missions on targets like the submarine pens on the French coast, which soaked up losses for little gain. And above all, he was under relentless pressure from Hap Arnold, his old friend and mentor, who sat in Washington demanding more missions, more results, faster, and who did not want to hear that the pace was killing the force. The historian David Metz, who examined the record closely, found little hard evidence that Eaker was a fool or a cynic. He found a commander in an impossible position, damned if he flew the deep raids and damned if he did not, because the only alternative to the costly raids was to fly no deep raids at all, and Arnold would never accept that. So this is not the story of a stupid man or a careless one. It is something more unsettling. It is the story of an intelligent, brave, decent officer who believed a beautiful idea too long, who could not quite let go of the faith he had helped build, even as the evidence came home in shattered aircraft and empty bunks. That is a more human failure and a more frightening one, because it is the kind of failure that thoughtful, capable people commit all the time. You have probably seen a smaller version of it in your own working life. The manager who built the system, who is proud of the system, who cannot hear the quiet voice from the floor saying the system is hurting people, because to hear it would mean admitting that the thing he built has a flaw at its heart. The evidence piles up. The good people keep paying the price, and the man in charge keeps explaining why the next quarter will prove the theory right. It is a very human thing. It is just that in Eaker's world, the cost of the flaw was measured in 19-year-olds who froze to death in the wreckage of a flying fortress. By the autumn of 1943, the strain between Eaker and Arnold had become severe. This was the hardest part of Eaker's position, and it deserves to be understood because the pressure did not come from the enemy alone. It came from Washington, from the friend and mentor who had helped make him. Hap Arnold was building the greatest air force in history against a ticking clock, and he wanted every bomber that reached England thrown into the fight at once. More sorties, more targets, more visible results to show the doubters that air power could win the war. He sent a steady stream of prodding messages across the Atlantic. He did not want to hear that crews needed rest, that the weather grounded the force for weeks at a stretch, that the loss rates could not be sustained at the tempo he demanded. Eaker stood in the middle, absorbing the pressure from above and spending the lives below, defending his men to Arnold and defending the doctrine to his men, caught between the two in a vice that tightened all year. Arnold wanted results the force could not deliver at a price it could survive. Eaker was defending men he was also sending to die. And then, in December of 1943, the ground shifted under him in a way he never saw coming. Dwight Eisenhower was named Supreme Allied Commander for the coming invasion of Europe. And Eisenhower did what commanders do. He brought his own trusted team north with him from the Mediterranean, where they had fought together in North Africa and Italy. Karl Spaatz, Eaker's old friend from the question mark, was to take command of the new United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, the umbrella over the whole American bombing effort. And a compact, brilliant, famous airman named James Doolittle, the man who had led the raid on Tokyo in 1942, was to take command of the 8th Air Force, Eaker's 8th. The force he had built from 6 officers and an idea in the cold and the rationing of wartime England, mission by bloody mission. It was to be handed to another man. On paper, it was a promotion. Eaker was not being demoted or disgraced. He was to go south and take over as Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, a sprawling command that included the American 12th and 15th Air Forces and British Air Forces as well. More air forces, a bigger map, a higher station. By September of 1943, he had already pinned on his 3rd star and become a lieutenant general. This was, by any measure a bureaucracy would recognize, a step up. Eaker did not experience it as a step up. He experienced it as exile, and he fought it with everything he had. He sent cables to Arnold, to Spaatz, to Eisenhower, pleading to keep his command. To Arnold, he sent a message arguing bluntly that the interest of the war would be best served by leaving him in command of the 8th Air Force. He wrote that after building this force from nothing, it would be heartbreaking to leave it now, just before the climax, just before the great blows of 1944 that he could feel coming. He had carried this thing through its darkest year. He wanted to be there when it triumphed. Eisenhower answered him with kindness and with an iron logic that could not be argued around. The Supreme Commander told Eaker, in effect, that he would have loved to keep him close, but that the Allies simply did not have enough top men to pile them all in one place. Eaker was too good to leave in England as a subordinate to Spaatz. He was needed to run a theater of his own. It was, in its way, a compliment. It was also the end of the thing he loved most. Parton, his biographer and former aide, called it the most painful transition in Eaker's career. And by other accounts, Eaker carried the wound for the rest of his long life, remembering the reassignment as a kind of betrayal, feeling that he had been moved out of the main event, just as the main event was about to begin. On January 6, 1944, James Doolittle formally took command of the 8th Air Force, and Ira Eaker went south to the Mediterranean, to a larger command in a smaller place in history. And now we come to the reversal, the cruel, beautiful, gut-wrenching turn that gives this story its shape. Because everything Eaker had wanted, everything he had built toward, everything he had bled his young men for, arrived in the sky over Germany in the weeks right after he left. The weapon came first. All through that autumn, even as Eaker was calling the long-range escort study premature, a fighter had been coming of age. The P-51 Mustang had started life as a mediocre aircraft, fast down low but gasping for breath at the altitudes where the bombers flew, because its original engine simply could not perform in the thin air. And then someone had the sense to take that superb, sleek airframe and fit it with a different engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license in America by the Packard Company. The transformation was total. The Merlin gave the Mustang the high-altitude performance it had lacked, and the Mustang's clean design and internal fuel capacity gave it something no other fighter of its class possessed. Range. Enormous range. With drop tanks under its wings, the P-51 could fly more than 1,600 miles. It could go to Berlin and fight and come home. The version that arrived over Germany in that first winter was the P-51B, and its close cousin the P-51C, with the framed cockpit canopy, the razorback line behind the pilot's head, not yet the clear bubble top of the later models. It reached England with the first Mustang group late in 1943 and flew its early missions as Eaker was on his way out the door. Here was the impossible thing, the fighter that could not exist, the escort that would add weight for no good purpose. It existed, it flew, and it changed everything. But a weapon is only as good as the idea behind it, and the second half of the reversal was the idea. When James Doolittle took over the 8th, he made a decision that Eaker, for all his gifts, had never been willing to make. The story goes that Doolittle visited the fighter headquarters and saw a sign on the wall declaring that the first duty of the fighters was to bring the bombers back alive. That sign anecdote is debated by historians, and no photograph of it has ever surfaced, so treat the tale of the sign with a little caution. But the decision behind it is beyond dispute. Doolittle turned the fighters loose. Instead of chaining them to the bombers in close escort, forced to fly slow and stay near their charges, he sent them ranging out ahead and to the sides, hunting, free to dive on German fighters wherever they found them, free to chase them down to the deck and shoot them on their own airfields. It was the exact opposite of the close escort mindset that had governed the 8th under the old Doctrine. And combined with the Mustang's range, it was decisive. Now the German fighters could not gather safely for their massed attacks, because American fighters were everywhere, deep over Germany, aggressive, lethal. The hunters had become the hunted. The proof came fast. In late February of 1944, in a series of raids the crews called Big Week, running from the 20th to the 25th, the 8th Air Force went after the German aircraft industry with the Mustangs ranging ahead, and this time, when the German fighters rose to defend, they were cut to pieces. Then in March came the raids on Berlin itself, the German capital, once thought untouchable by day, now under American bombs with American fighters overhead. The Luftwaffe threw its pilots into these battles and lost them faster than they could be replaced. German aircraft factories could rebuild the machines. Germany could not rebuild the experienced pilots dying in the spring skies of 1944. The back of the German day fighter force was broken in those weeks, and it never recovered. Look at the raw change in strength, because the numbers tell the story better than any speech. At the end of Eaker's command in December of 1943, The 8th could call on a few hundred long-range fighters. Within about a month of Doolittle taking over, with the Mustangs pouring in, that force had grown to more than 1,000 long-range fighters, and it was being used with a boldness the old doctrine had never allowed. The tool Eaker had ranked as a low priority became, almost overnight, the war-winning weapon of the daylight campaign. And here's where the reversal cuts the deepest. Ira Eaker had been right about the thing that mattered most, and wrong about the thing that killed his men, and he was removed just before he could be proven both. He was right that daylight precision bombing could work and could help win the war. It did. He was wrong that the bomber could do it alone. It could not. It needed the fighter he had neglected, flown with the aggression he had never authorized. Doolittle inherited the weapon and the moment, and Doolittle got the credit for the victory, and Eaker watched it from a headquarters in Italy, running a different war. There is one last image, and it is the one that ought to stay with you longest, because it shows the size of the man underneath the tragedy. On June 6th, 1944, the day of the invasion of Normandy, Ira Eaker was far away, on business connected to shuttle bombing missions to bases in Russia. When word reached him that the landings were underway, the news he waited for was not about the beaches or the troops. It was about the sky. Had the German Air Force appeared over the invasion fleet, the way it might have a year earlier, it could have turned the beaches into a slaughter. The German Air Force did not appear. It could not. It had been destroyed in the spring over Germany by the escorted daylight campaign, by the bombers Eaker built and the fighters Doolittle unleashed. The skies over the greatest invasion in history belonged to the Allies, completely and totally, and not a single Allied soldier on those beaches was bombed by a German aircraft in any strength. When Eaker learned that the German Air Force had failed to show over Normandy, he called it the greatest personal satisfaction of his entire war. Think about the grace in that. He had been moved out of the command he loved. Another man was wearing the laurels. And on the day it all came together, Eaker's joy was not for himself. It was for the thing he had built, doing exactly what he had always promised it would do on the most important morning of the war. The force he created had cleared the sky. That was enough for him. That was everything. So what do we make of Ira Eaker? That is the question this channel exists to sit with, honestly, without a tidy answer. Was he the general who defended a doctrine that killed his own crews? Yes. That is true, and we should not soften it, because the men who died at Schweinfurt deserve the truth. He held to the self-defending bomber too long. He called the escort study premature when escort was the most urgent need in his theater. He ranked drop tanks a low priority while his young men were being cut down for the lack of them. The doctrine he championed was tested over Germany in 1943, and it failed, and the bill was paid in the lives of teenagers. But was he also a genuine pioneer, a brave pilot, a brilliant advocate who saved daylight bombing at Casablanca when a lesser man would have let it die? A commander trapped by shortages and pressure and the honest engineering limits of his moment, a man who could have grabbed the glory of 1944 and instead rejoiced simply that the sky was clear over the beaches. Also, yes, all of that is equally true. Here's what I keep coming back to, and I will lay my own view on the table and let you tell me if I am wrong. The tragedy of Ira Eaker is not the tragedy of a bad man. It is the tragedy of a good man who could not let go of an idea in time. He built something magnificent and something fatally flawed at the same time, and he was removed at the precise hinge of history where the flaw was about to be fixed, and the magnificence was about to be proven. He got neither the full blame he perhaps deserved for the doctrine, nor the full credit he certainly deserved for the foundation. History handed both to the man who came after, and Eaker, to his lasting honor, seems to have made his peace with that, because the only thing he ever really wanted was for the thing to work. And it worked. Tammy Davis Biddle wrote that these airmen saw what they wanted to see. Maybe the deepest lesson of Ira Eaker is that seeing what we want to see is not the failing of fools. It is the failing of believers, of builders, of the very people committed enough to create something in the first place. The same conviction that let Eaker stand in front of Churchill and save the daylight campaign was the conviction that let him send his boys back to Schweinfurt. Strength and blindness from the same root. That is the gap this channel keeps returning to. The distance between the men who decided and the boys who paid. Eaker lived on both sides of it. He was a pilot who knew the cockpit, and a general who signed the orders, and somewhere between the two he lost sight, for one long and terrible year, of what his certainty was costing the 19-year-olds in the waist windows. If you have made it this far, then you care about this history the way we do, and I would ask you 3 things. Tell us in the comments where you come down on Ira Eaker, defender of a deadly doctrine, or a good man in an impossible chair, or both at once. If your family has a thread that runs back to the 8th, a grandfather in a bomber, a great-uncle in a fighter, a name on a wall, share it, because those stories are the reason we do this. And if this account gave the men of Schweinfurt their due, pass it to someone who would want to understand what those boys flew into and why. This is Air Command. We tell the story of the officers who decided and the boys who died, and we try never to forget which was which. Until the next mission, keep them in the air and keep them in memory. Clear skies.